Ellis Wilson's painting, The Field Workers, really is about going to work. Wilson had met a landlock in 1927 in Chicago during something called the Negro and Art Week. And he was so inspired listening to Locke talk that he moved to New York to do paintings that, in his words, would be a credit to my race. He said, though, after having spent some time in New York, that he'd always wanted to go south. A little more about that when we come to Jacob Lawrence. Well, in 1944, he got a Guggenheim Fellowship that finally made it possible. So he traveled around really coastal areas mostly in South Carolina and Georgia. And what he discovered surprised him. He said the people in the South have such great hopes. He said they had hopes that they could soon vote, hopes that education would soon be free and open. He said his own hope was that he could capture their hope in his work. Well, this painting shows a family walking along a dirt path beside these towering tobacco plants. We know they're poor. The whole family has to work, even the little girl minding the baby who's, trailing behind. But the time in the South, and this painting in particular, marked an important shift for Wilson. It really changed his view of the world. His style shifted, his palette shifted. He started using bright colors. I mean, the palette here is truly wonderful. And he started outlining. You see there's not a lot of shadowing to the figures. He started using these clear outlines that a New York Times critic who talked about his work said gave the people in his paintings a simple dignity. Well, lest we think that Southern sharecropping themes disappeared in the late 40s or early 50s, this is Benny Andrews' painting called The Long Rows. Well, Andrews was younger than McNeil and Wilson. He really was part of the civil rights generation rather than the Harlem Renaissance moment. He moved to New York in the late 50s, and by the mid-60s was thinking a lot about what he could do to advance the cause of civil rights. He took a leadership role in the Black Emergency Cultural Coalition, and he started a series of paintings based on memories of his childhood as the son of sharecroppers in Georgia. So The Long Rows, it really is an autobiographical picture. I mean, we know absolutely nothing about who this person is. We only see her from the back. But the beautiful curve of her back tells about the toll that working in the fields takes on her body. What I find really compelling here, as with the McNeil photograph, is the low vantage point. Here, it's the viewpoint of a child. I can't help but think it's a memory, maybe, of times when Andrews worked the fields behind his mother when he was a little boy. Well, Andrews came a long way. In the late 70s, he was tapped to head up the visual arts program at the National Endowment for the Arts. It was an incredibly prestigious and influential position. And what he liked about it, he stayed for a couple of years. It gave him a platform to promote his vision of a racially and culturally inclusive American art. Now, as we move along to the civil rights era, we think of it as the 50s and particularly the 60s, but it's happening much, much earlier. Partially because there were a number of books that came out, really from the 40s and the 50s and into the 60s. One of the most powerful early images, I think, of the civil rights era is this painting by Jacob Lawrence. It's called Bar and Grill. Well, Lawrence grew up in Harlem, so he was in this wonderful cultural ferment. He was engaged with intellectuals, with artists, but his mother was from the South. So he said that it wasn't not just for him, but for African Americans all over the country. He said, and this is a quote, "Your life had a Southern flavor. It wasn't an alien experience to you, even if you'd never been there." Well, finally, just as he finished his migration series, his famous series that is now owned half by the Museum of Modern Art in New York and half by the Phillips Collection in Washington, he got a grant and he went to New Orleans. This is the summer of 1941. It was his first trip below the Mason-Dixon line, and I have to tell you, it was a real shock. In Harlem, he'd been listening to talk about art and social responsibility, but in New Orleans, he found himself in a Jim Crow state where he had to ride in the back of the bus and live in a racially segregated neighborhood. Well, he was only there for a couple of months, but the works that he did there, I think, are really incredibly powerful. This one, you almost don't need to say a thing about it. We're looking at the interior of a cafe with a floor-to-ceiling wall that divides the space into two distinct realms. Whites are on the left, blacks are on the right. He also makes the not-so-subtle point about the way they're treated differently. We're talking New Orleans in the summertime. It's hot, humid. The customers on the left have a ceiling fan, so they can be cooled. And even though they're in the same place, that wall, with the little spaces between the boards, you'd think it would make it a porous. It doesn't. But it emphasizes the disparity of their two separate worlds. Now, how do you get the message out when you have something to say? If you're a visual artist, you make one piece or a series of pieces, and they may be shown in an art gallery, or a collector may buy them. How do you find a reach that makes what you think and believe and do, available, accessible to a huge audience? Well, Gordon Parks was one of the people who figured this out early on. He first realized the power of mass media when he was working as a dining car waiter for the Northern Pacific Railway, and he saw all the pictorial magazines that people were leaving behind. They'd get up from dinner and leave their magazine on the table. So he bought a camera, got a job with the Farm Security Administration, and started taking pictures. Well, he was good enough by the mid-40s that in 1948 he approached Life magazine with his portfolio, and he pitched a freelance story on Harlem's gangs. Well, the editors were fascinated. The result was a photo essay titled Harlem Gang Leader. Red Jackson's life is one of fear, frustration, and violence. So instead of being sort of an accusatory kind of a tone to this thing, it ultimately was really tough, but it was also very empathetic. The lead photograph in the story you see on the left, it's called Harlem Gang Warfare. The figures are shadowy. They're barely touched by ambient light. You can tell. He's sort of down in the gutter in the street, photographing up at these young men who are in a pitched battle. He's using ambient light. If there were flash bulbs, we would certainly be able to see the image better and see better what was happening below, what's happening above. But I think he powerfully captured both the aggression, but also the vulnerability of the young gang members. Well, for the next 20 years, Parks did something like 300 assignments for Life magazine. Not all with this depth and power. He did fashion shoots in Paris, he did portraits. There's a wonderful portrait of Alexander Calder, a great portrait of Malcolm X, and he changed lives. His powerful and sensitive pictures literally introduced millions of Americans to the circumstances of people that they rarely encountered. Parks always said that, and this is a quote from him, "It's the heart, not the eye, that should determine the content of the photograph." Well, his pictorial essays had a huge impact. Although I'll probably run out of time before we're finished, I will just tell you this. He did a spread, a photo essay spread on a Brazilian boy, poor kid in the favela in Rio, who was suffering from some curable disease, but his family had no way to get out of Brazil. Well, Life ran the series, money poured in from all over the country, people who'd seen the story. And so they were able to bring the kid to the United States, get him treatment, and then take him back home and buy a house so that his family would be able to live in an environment where he and his brothers and sisters would not continue to be ill. Abstract expressionist generation, 1950s and 60s here, grew up in Harlem when Booker T. Washington, Du Bois, Alain Locke, and everybody was talking about racial identity. And Lewis was a founding member of the Harlem Artists Guild, which was committed, according to their manifesto, to fighting for the Negro artist's legitimate place as a worthwhile force in society. But Lewis was conflicted. On one hand, we see in Evening Rendezvous. Evening Rendezvous, it's kind of a poetic, gentle title. It's a classic abstract expressionist canvas, but it's also a painting of outrage and protest. The dabs of white that you see resemble robed and hooded figures gathered around a hot red bonfire. In the front, you wonder if the headlights are brightly illuminating. In the back, figures are obscured by smoke. And I think it's not accidental, but certainly ironic, that the palette is fundamentally red, white, and blue. So he's also mocking the veil of patriotism that was often pulled as an explanation for why things happened as they did. And the last sort of specific civil rights era photograph that I want to show you is this amazing picture of a Mississippi Freedom Marcher in 1963 taken by Roy DeCarava. I mean, he was a freelance photographer for all of the major magazines, Look, Life, Newsweek, Fortune, which was good because it allowed him to see the civil rights movement firsthand. There's a deeply personal quality to his photographs. Subtle tones of black and gray really define the expression and the character of this photograph. And I think they create a bond between us as viewers and this determined but slightly frightened young woman who essentially is risking everything to participate in a protest march in Mississippi. Now, the last sort of category that I wanted to mention was the notion of affirmation. It comes through in all sorts of ways. Alan Rowan Wright's painting called School's Out and Beaufort Delaney's Campfire in the Park really represent polar opposites in terms of urban experience, but they both convey a sense of community that reflects their deep-seated beliefs in what ultimately counts. Wright thought of himself as an artist reporter. He told me, he said, I just gave myself the assignment to capture all the people in Boston's black neighborhoods. He said he was tired of the stereotypical images that pervaded, this is now in the mid-1930s, that pervaded American mass culture. So he wanted to paint ordinary humans who do the homely things that people do, things like going to the store or coming out of school. So he did this series that he called his Neighborhoods series. Painting's more than just, a document and sort of a romanticized version of kids coming out of school. It is a record of a place that was torn down in urban renewal, and so it doesn't exist anymore. But I think what he's doing here is making really a universal statement about community, about stability, and the bonds of family life. Well, Beaufort Delaney is showing us people standing around, men standing warming their hands at a fire in a trash can. Delaney moved to New York from Boston, but his first day was a total disaster. Someone gave him the name of a boarding house, so he went there, he paid a month's rent, left his stuff, went out to explore the city, came back at the end of the day, and the woman said, I've never seen you before. He hadn't gotten a receipt, so he was stuck, and he ended up spending his first night in New York in the park. Well, he said the camaraderie of the men, they all helped him out, they all, made sure he had something to eat. So there is, as different as these paintings are in subject, they are ultimately about the same thing, and that is this human connectedness. This I can't skip over. Roland Freeman, because he wanted to celebrate sort of the special rituals and ceremonies and events that take place within the African American community that are often invisible to everybody else. Because of this, in 2007, he was awarded a National Heritage Fellowship and the Best Lomax Hawes Award for a lifetime of artistic excellence and contributions to the nation's traditional arts heritage. Well, what he's showing here, the title is Bikers Take a Break, is a group of young men. I mean, they're hip guys, they're showing off their bodies, they're having fun in this park in downtown Baltimore. But Sunday afternoons is when African Americans gathered at Druid Hill Park to celebrate the beating of the drums. Well, it was a reminder of the time in history when drumming was banned by slave owners because they thought it kept alive the legacy of African culture. Early Hudnall in Houston, this man works all the time. I really had to track him down. He said that one of the things, he worked for the Model Cities program in the 1960s, early 70s, and he said working for the program inspired him to document life as it is. He said it's the simple things in life, how we live from day to day, what we do on special holidays, family kinds of things. So that's what he's showing us here in this photograph he called The Guardian. The father is, just holding on to the daughter. But look at the expression on her face. It's magic. Her daddy is holding on to her. But one of the things that I think is particularly telling is that he has an American flag, tucked behind his ear into his glasses. So, he's conveying warmth and affection to his child, but he's also passing on a sense of community and a sense of patriotic pride. They are Americans. Now, I want to close with John Bigger's Shotgun 3rd Ward, number 1. This is an image of resilience and strength in the face of loss. See, the children are playing in a water-drenched street. They are totally oblivious to the burned-out church behind them, and presumably it's the fire hose water that they're playing in. The adults can barely look at their church, mostly destroyed. You have to wonder if Bigger's got the idea after the rash of church bombings in the early 1960s. But the painting really is only partly about tragedy. The woman here in the middle with graying hair is really an anchor. She stabilizes the scene. So she's front and center, she's larger than the other figures. And the pastor, just to her right, is holding a glowing candle inside a small lantern. He's keeping the spirit of the church and the community alive.